Hello, welcome to CripChat weekly podcast on everything disability. This week we're joined by Trinity Ford from People with Disabilities Australia. How are you,
I'm really
Trinity?
well. I'm really well, Jonathan. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to get into the topic today because this is a area of some interest for me.
So, today we're discussing political discourse and people with disabilities. Firstly, explain what constitutes ableist rhetoric and why it's harmful.
Absolutely. So, ableist rhetoric, I suppose, ultimately refers to just language and attitudes and assumptions that devalue or discriminate against people with disability. So that might be, explicit like slurs or derogatory comments, but it can be implicit stuff as well. So, like, using disability related terms as insults is something that we sometimes see, and just sort of promoting stereotypes, or can also just be speaking over disabled people and, erasing our experiences. So, this sort of rhetoric is all rooted in ableism, which another way of thinking about that is just the systemic oppression of people with disability based on the belief that abled people are superior rather than that these are all just natural variations in the way that human bodies come about. And I suppose that we'll get into the reasons why it's harmful. Um, but these are particularly because they undermine our control over our own lives and our autonomy and exclude us. So, yeah, I think that we're going to get into some more detail around that as well.
Discuss specific instances cited by PWDA, such as the use of derogatory terms and negative stereotyping of mental illness during campaign events.
Absolutely. So, PWDA, my organization, has seen a few instances of derogatory terms and the sort of negative stereotyping of mental illness across the campaign. So, we've been alarmed by, stereotyping of people with psychosocial disability. There have been some reports of slurs used throughout the campaign and some really alarming examples of the R word being used at campaign events to also bring in slurs against people with cognitive impairment. And to think a little bit more broader, before this election campaign in the last session of Parliament, the Prime Minister famously used Tourette's to criticise one of his political opponents, which the Tourette's community, me included, as one of my several disabilities, all came out absolutely against that kind of language being used against people with disability.
Explore how such language affects the disability community's participation in political process.
Yeah. When this sort of language is used about disabled people, it affects our ability to participate in politics because we're excluded. There's a whole bunch of ways that ableist language drives different kinds of exclusion. So I'll talk through some of those now. Um, I mean, it has a profound and lasting impact on our ability to participate, not just this campaign, but also in previous campaigns. So we're talking about how ableist language creates cultural assumptions and maintains cultural assumptions that people with disability are not capable of political leadership or activism or even being able to vote properly, being trusted to exercise our votes. So PWDA joined a large open letter calling for reforms to the Australian Electoral Commission's process on striking off people with cognitive impairment from the role, so that there are ways in which it's very easy for someone who's suspected to have some kind of cognitive impairment to be disenfranchised and have their ability to vote removed. The ableist language and the way that that drives these cultural attitudes and assumptions about disabled people is one of the key drivers for disabled people losing their right to vote, because it's very often supposedly well-meaning family members and doctors and support people around somebody who might have their right to vote stripped from them. It's these people who then make the referral. Often this is accompanied with sort of attitudes and justifications like, oh, you know, she doesn't know what's going on. She's got a mental age of whatever. Oh, it's a little bit too hard for her. We don't want her to get in trouble for forgetting to vote, rather than looking at like what are the ways that we can support this person being able to participate in the political process, right? Yeah. So then there's other flow-on effects of marginalization and language as well, just that these drive other kinds of segregation. That when disabled people are in closed environments, like group homes, special schools, sheltered workshops, or any kind of institution stuck in hospitals, we can't as easily participate in the political process. And that's what the Disability Royal Commission, particularly the disabled commissioners on the Royal Commission, were calling for. This is one of the key reasons why we need to address segregation in our society, is because when we stick disabled people over in some other corner of society, we don't have these more really important informal ways of being able to speak to each other and understand the different problems and solutions for things in society. These are all the ways that we need to be engaged in the political process. So we've also seen a tick up in online vilification, which I think that we'll get to a little bit later on in more detail, but that's another way that language affects our participation. If we're being yelled at online and called slurs, we're much less likely to participate in one of those really key spaces that social media is a town square for being able to share our ideas and collaborate. So if we're being hounded out of some social media platforms, then that's another barrier for us being able to participate properly. So yeah, quite a few things.
Thank you for that. Summarize PDA's media release urging political parties and candidates to commit to respectful and inclusive discourse.
Totally. So PWDA has been calling for respectful leadership through this campaign that's just ended, but also much more broadly, of course. So we put out a media release that was urging political parties and candidates to commit, as you said, to respectful and inclusive discourse. So we told the media and the community that language matters and that words that belittle, dehumanize, or stereotype people with disability fuel discrimination and exclusion. So these are things that cause real harm. And there's no excuse for this kind of rhetoric in Australian public life. There never was, and there particularly isn't now. It's inexcusable. This is especially at a time when our community is seeking leadership that will take real action to end the violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation against us and the inequality that we continue enduring. So PWDA is also concerned about, as I was just saying before, the rise of ableist abuse and misinformation on social media, where because of particularly changes to the way that these platforms do content moderation, facing increased vilification online. And yeah, so we've called on leaders to be more responsible with this. So if political leaders are serious about addressing that inequality, they have to reject divisive and harmful narratives. And they need to focus on delivering actual real reforms for disabled people. That's really what we need. So our political leaders are really critical in how they frame the political discussion. And this is discussion that then other citizens take cues on, and that it frames how they relate to one another. So by our political leaders setting a respectful tone and using inclusive language, they can then better promote unity and reflect the nation's diversity and help build a more equitable society. And I was really reassured to see in the Prime Minister's victory speech, he used some of this language. I think that the defeat of the coalition, it's been understood quite widely across the media and society as being a rejection of Trump-style politics. That the public said, we don't want a really negative campaign of pushing people down and punching down. And the way that the Prime Minister in his victory speech sort of framed the dialogue moving forward, and he's been pretty consistent with that through the campaign as well, is bringing it back to Australian values as lifting everybody up and making sure that everybody has the opportunity to participate and be their best selves. And that there was a cheeky reference in his speech to that's the way that we make our country the best it can be, by making sure that each citizen has the opportunity to be the best that they can be. And there might be different ways that people across the political spectrum understand the right way of doing that. For PWDA, that's been outlined in our election platform, which had a really overwhelmingly positive response from our members in the community, which we really appreciated. But yeah, so to sum that up, it's that our political leaders shape the national dialogue, and they've got a lot of power about how they frame debates on these key issues, immigration and First Nations rights and gender equality are other examples of that. The second is influencing public attitudes, that Australians look to political leaders for cues. And when leaders are respectful, then we see that reflected at the broader population level. And we also want to see leaders being responsible in times of crises. So during, for example, bushfires, the cyclone that started this campaign up in Queensland, pandemic, social unrest, the way that leaders communicate can either reassure and unify, or it can incite fear and fragmentation. So calm, inclusive, and clear messaging is really important for maintaining that social trust and keeping disabled people safe and, able to keep participating in the electoral process.
Examine how media coverage can perpetuate or challenge ableist narrative.
I love this question. It always takes me back to Stella Young's fierce advocacy in this area. Media coverage, it holds immense power, really, in shaping these societal perceptions. Just the same as the way that our leaders are talking to the public, the way that the media is either directly talking to the public or is shaping the way that other people speak to us, holds a lot of power. So that can help shape societal expectations and perceptions of disability in ways that either reinforce or disrupt ableist narratives. So we really want to make sure that we're getting it more often to the disrupting part. So there are some media tropes that we commonly come across. Things like, people with disability in a lot of media are often either, the tragic victim of their, our bodies collapse, or of some sort of exploitation, which is then often not about actually us. It's about some sort of idea of us and perpetuating a trope. The other trope is of the inspirational hero, right? This is Stella Young talking about, inspiration porn and such. It's about how we can lift up abled people and make them feel better. Like, oh, okay, well, if this person with, one leg or what have you, it's always a visible disability because it's a type of porn, right? Oh, well, if they can run a marathon, then I'm sure that I can get my lazy butt up and get to work. So that's a really problematic stereotype that we need to interfere with, that devalues disabled people's roles in our own lives and in societies. And the third common media trope that we come across is the burden. So you'll see this in often tied to attacks on our rights to welfare. There was a lot of this around key parts of the rollout of the Disability Discrimination Act and sort of successive reforms to it, where maybe sometimes you see media being like, okay, we really want to make sure that people with disability can participate equally in society, but we're just concerned about the burden of that flowing on to shop owners or whatever who might need to pay a lot of money to make their store accessible. So that's framing people with disability as a burden rather than understanding that we need to have a fully inclusive society and that that's a priority for us, and we can have a conversation about the best way to fund the sort of infrastructure changes we need to get there. But we should never bring it back to disabled people being burdens. All of those cliches strip us of our complexity. And yeah, they just reinforce a really limited view of disability. So some ways that media could go forward from here instead, and you see some really good examples of this in different parts of the media. They could even just adopt a social model approach, which for us over on this side of the disability space is, often seen as quite a limited theoretical model for understanding disability. But that's how far behind some pockets of the media are. Certainly other more robust models like the embodiment model are very helpful as well. But yeah, focusing more on social barriers rather than individual impairment would be a good way of interfering with all three of those tropes. And it shifts the narrative towards the advocacy and rights-based and systemic reform that we need. We also really need media coverage that explores accessibility and discrimination and what the actual policy impacts of mainstream policies are to us, as well as some more work on inclusive design, what universal design looks like for people with disability. And there's low-hanging fruit as well here. We can look at person-first language, and framing stories around achievements and creativity and normal life experiences rather than just the disability. That helps to normalize diverse experiences, that we're talking about somebody else, someone who just happens to be disabled. A lot of these are kind of low-hanging fruit for us in the disability activist space, but areas that we can win some achievements when we're working with the media.
Discuss the right of evidence abuse and misinformation on social media during the election period as noted by PWDA.
Absolutely. So People with Disability Australia, just from conversations with my media team, we've noticed a real uptick in hate speech and ableist abuse on social media, as well as misinformation and sometimes active disinformation about disabled people circling around on social media. It highlights, as I said before, that online platforms really need to be safe and fully inclusive spaces for civic participation and free speech. That we do political communication online a lot as a society now, and that if these are arenas which are becoming increasingly spaces where we can be vilified, then they're not safe for us to be there. And this applies not just for people with disability, but most other marginalized groups, especially where that marginalization intersects and overlaps and compounds. So a lot of this we suspect is coming from changes to content moderations on some of these sites, particularly X, Twitter, and Meta, Facebook, Instagram, where we're seeing since the Trump inauguration a really different approach to how free speech happens in these spaces. So I suppose a way of understanding this is that there's a lot of kind of legal writing around how free speech should work. In Australia, we have a really limited form of constitutional protection for free speech, which isn't as relevant here. But free speech is a really important, it's a really important part of our political system, and it's a really important value that we should be protecting. And already built into the way that academics and people write about free speech is that it doesn't extend to vilification and it doesn't extend to inciting violence and hate speech, because these aren't forms of speech which improve civic discourse. These are just forms of speech that cause violence. And appropriately, we draw a line on that and we allow the state to regulate and get involved and stop people saying those things. And the same for social media. The sites end up like mini states. Facebook is kind of its own mini kingdom with Zuckerberg as the king. And we need those sites to do proper content moderation to ensure that free speech is happening in the appropriate way, because otherwise we can't use it and we can't access our own free speech. It necessarily goes both ways. It's not, free speech has never been and never should be an absolute. It's a value that ties to an actual outcome, which is improving the political discourse. And you want very few restrictions on how the state gets involved in that, but vilification and hate speech and inciting violence is the really clear example where we should be saying no to that. And online platforms are allowing that to happen, and we find that really concerning. And this overlaps with, attacks in the US on diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives and such like this. We need to be protecting diversity of all kinds, including diversity of opinion online, and making sure that we can participate.
How can resources like the PWDA language guide be used to promote a more inclusive political dialogue?
Absolutely. So PWDA's language guide is a free resource. It's available on our website under our resources tab. And it's applicable in any and all settings. It's a kind of robust but basic document which attempts to get people who might be a bit less familiar with some of the best ways of speaking about disability issues, a really easy, digestible way of being able to understand what the best practice is. And there might be, some disability communities take a more robust approach. Like, for example, your podcast is called CripChat. We definitely wouldn't be encouraging anybody outside the community to use the word crip. It's a slur that's been reclaimed by us, and I proudly identify as a crip. But with respect to my mobility disability. But it's also really important to be able to give, like mainstream Australia, easy reference guide on how to improve their language. So that's also available, and it's very applicable to inclusive political dialogue. It just uses the kind of things that we've been talking about before, about making sure that we remove inadvertent and deliberate ableist language, and make sure that people with disability feel comfortable being able to participate. Yeah, our yeah.
How can listeners actively participate in political discussions and advocate for respectful discourse?
So you listeners can ensure that you're participating in political discussions by getting out there and having them best you can. A lot of us face real barriers to being able to do that. But for most of us, we've got ways of being able to do that. For a lot of us, that's even if that's on safer sides of social media or what have you. And at the same time, keep an eye out for inappropriate discourse, and where it's safe to do so, call it out and draw on the wider community. It's important that that we don't have just one person taking the heat for this. We're a very wide, very well connected community to each other, and we can all lean on each other to put pressure on people who are speaking in a way that we find offensive. And I suppose the other component is to find your allies. It's really important to find allies inside and outside of this disability community, people with more power and privilege than us. So as a trans woman, I love to lean on my cis allies to get out there and spread the word on, interfering with transphobia that's in the media. I do so myself. I'm in a position of huge privilege, particularly with this platform. But it helps a lot to have other people to lean on, as well as when we're out there doing this work, it's exhausting. So pacing yourself and leaning on community. Community is really the thing that gives me a lot of my drive and energy. I find when I'm with my friends and in community, surrounded by queer and trans, autistic, disabled people, that's a space that's really really lifts me back up and really recharges me. And everybody has their own little space like that to be able to go back to and recuperate a bit and then get back out into the fray, fighting a good fight.
Are there instances where political figures have effectively used inclusive language and policy?
Yeah, so there are many politicians really doing great work here and leading the way. So PWDA always loves to give a shout out to our allies in Parliament, people like Dr. Monique Ryan, who endorsed most of our political platform, our election platform, and Andrew Wilkie, who endorsed all of that, and Senator Jordan Steele-John, is for his whole time in the Senate, has been a really fierce and consistent advocate for people with disability. So you see from people like this, not only is their language usually really appropriate and spot on, but it's backed up with the substance, which is the really important thing. And that's what we really want to see. That because as I said at the start, we're talking about how all of these things really overlap. That ableism and ableist language drives a lot of the barriers to our political participation, and also leads to things like segregation. So we really want to see people who are not just using the correct language, but then also tying it to the actual policy outcomes that we need politicians to be passing to improve our lives. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Trinity. It's so great to share your wisdom and experience. You've been watching CripChat Weekly podcast on everyday disability. Join us next time for your weekly podcast on everyday disability. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one. Thanks, Jonathan.